Ballroom of the Tycoons Club, a haze of mocking lights and expensive champagne. CEO Victoria Sterling, all power and silk, issued a cutting, public challenge to the crowded room. The cold CEO then declared, "Beat me at chess and I'll marry you." All eyes moved to the corner. A quiet single father, plainly dressed, completely an outsider. The crowd laughed, treating his participation as a cruel, quick joke. She condescendingly hit the clock. Elias looked at the board, silent and calm. His first move was quiet. The room was loud until the lightning-fast, devastating third move landed. The single father was 34-year-old Elias Vance. His life was a study in practical minimalism and profound sacrifice. He wore a simple, clean suit, the best he owned, but it lacked the sheen of the tailored silk and expensive wool surrounding him. He was a muted watercolor in a room full of striking oils, trying desperately to blend into the shadows. Elias wasn't a guest at this glittering, exclusive event. He was an employee. His current, humble role was night shift maintenance technician for the very club hosting the lavish Christmas party. He had taken the job precisely for its miserable hours and low visibility, which allowed him the flexibility to prioritize his 7-year-old son, Leo. The divorce 2 years prior had been less an ending and more an emotional amputation. Elias's ex-wife, a high-powered attorney, had found the quiet, dedicated life of a family man suffocating. When Elias was forced to choose between a professional chess career, which demanded constant travel and intense focus, and the stability Leo desperately needed, he didn't hesitate. He traded the brilliance of the Grandmaster circuit for the steady, unglamorous utility of a blue-collar job. Leo was his new, non-negotiable career. Tonight, he was forced to bring Leo with him. The babysitter, a college student, had left a panicked, last-minute message about a family emergency. The simple reality of Elias's life was that work couldn't be missed. Every hour was calculated. Leo, a quiet boy with enormous, nervous brown eyes, was tucked into a chair in a quiet service hallway, dutifully sketching in a notebook, promised a large, sugary soda once the work shift was over. Elias had instructed him sternly, yet kindly, to be invisible and silent. The ballroom felt like a golden cage, radiating an almost painful affluence. Elias was making his final sweep, checking the lighting grid near the lounge, when the crowd suddenly swelled around a central marble table. That's when Victoria Sterling arrived. Her presence wasn't just physical, it was atmospheric. She was the name synonymous with aggressive mergers, flawless precision, and absolute success. A true power broker who never lost in business or in life. She commanded the room with an almost glacial confidence, and the chessboard, polished and waiting, was clearly her royal throne. For Victoria, chess was more than a game. It was her power stage. It was a cultivated public ritual where she routinely crushed rivals and partners, using the intellectual game as a metaphor for her market dominance. Her wins were swift, elegant humiliations that reinforced her reputation as a mind untouchable. She expected opponents to crumble not just under her strategy, but under her sheer willpower. When she spotted Elias and the boy, whom she naturally assumed were accidental strays from the service staff, she barely registered them as human beings. They were a momentary, insignificant blemish on her perfect evening. Her sweeping gaze held nothing but cold dismissal. She turned back to the men gathered, her smile predatory and slightly bored. "Gentlemen, you all wish to partner with me, but business is merely a form of romance, and I only partner with equals." She paused, allowing the anticipation to build. "So here is the challenge. Beat me at chess, right here, right now, and I'll, quite literally, marry you." The room dissolved into amused, nervous laughter. It was a joke, as a dismissal, a display of untouchable arrogance that only the truly powerful can afford. The laughter died when a drunk venture capitalist wanting to escalate the entertainment spotted Elias. "How about the man from the corner, Victoria? Give the little guy a shot for Christmas charity." Victoria's eyes narrowed, then she laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that cut like glass. "Fine. Let the cleaning crew try. It will be a lesson in knowing your place." She invited Elias over, not with genuine courtesy, but with the weary patience one shows to a persistent pest. Elias felt the immediate, intense rush of humiliation. He saw the condescension, the clear, unspoken message that he was nothing more than a momentary spectacle. His heart sank, but his face remained a mask of quiet composure. Leo, seeing the tension, tugged nervously at his father's sleeve. His eyes were wide with fear for his dad. "Dad, you don't have to play. Let's just go home. Please." Elias knelt, the warmth of his son's small body momentarily grounding him. He brushed a loose strand of hair from Leo's forehead. He smiled a genuine, steady smile, a smile that said, "I am in control, even here. It's okay, buddy. We don't run from a challenge. Sometimes you have to play the game they ask you to play, but you play it your way." He stood up, the laughter around him echoing. He accepted the challenge, not out of pride or delusion, but because of the look in his son's eyes, a look that saw his father being mocked and measured as worthless. Elias needed to show Leo that true worth was internal, unshaken by external status or wealth. He walked to the table, adjusted his chair with quiet deliberation, and sat down. His hands, though slightly calloused from maintenance work, rested on the pieces with an unnatural familiarity, an almost reverent gentleness. He felt the weight of the clock, the weight of the audience, and the familiar, satisfying weight of the wooden pieces. A few older guests, veterans of life who knew how to read people, noticed the unusual stillness in his movements. There was no defiance, no nervousness, only a deep, centered calm. But the general snickering persisted until Victoria hit the clock and the game truly began. Victoria Sterling, playing white, initiated the game with a powerful Queen's Gambit accepted, her signature opening. It was calculated, aggressive, and designed to rapidly seize the center of the board, suffocating her opponent under a crushing volume of options. Her intention was clear: end this spectacle in under 10 moves, demonstrate her superiority, and move on. The crowd exhaled, anticipating the rapid collapse. This was Victoria's guaranteed method, an overwhelming display of force that forced errors early. Most bets among the guests were already settled on the game, lasting no more than 7 minutes. The air was thick with expectation of the inevitable. Elias, playing black, did not rush. He took a full minute for his first move, letting Victoria capture the central space and develop her pieces aggressively. He seemed content to play a quiet, seemingly passive defensive position, merely reacting to her powerful surge. He was inviting her deeper, allowing her to overcommit to the center. Leo, standing a respectful distance back near the velvet rope, watched his father. He knew this man, the man who patiently fixed bikes, who helped him with math, who read him stories. But the man sitting at the board was different. He was completely still, his focus absolute, his presence immense. The small nervous tics Leo usually saw were gone. Elias's first move was an unusual variation of the Caro-Kann defense, a seemingly innocuous pawn move that surprised the few serious chess players in the room. Victoria barely registered it, seeing only a weak, cautious play, the expected timidness of an amateur. He's playing scared, she thought with a flicker of satisfaction. Predictable. His second move, however, caused a collective ripple of confusion that was harder to ignore. It wasn't a standard defense. It was a highly specialized counter-development, a move so subtle it seemed to defy classical logic, yet created a cramped, complex, and deeply asymmetrical position. It gave up surface initiative entirely, but created a coiled, kinetic tension beneath the surface. One of the club's resident chess masters, a man who had just scoffed, ran a quick mental scan of the resulting position. His eyebrows knitted together, his expression shifting from amusement to professional alarm. He saw that while Victoria held all the apparent advantages, space, mobility, piece development, the board was suddenly oddly constrained. The typical free-flowing trajectory of her attack was being subtly redirected into a narrow, fatal chute. The initial, loud laughter in the room faded into a dull, low murmur, then ceased altogether. The sudden silence was heavier than the music, heavier than the cold air outside. Victoria's confidence began to fracture, imperceptibly at first. She was used to opponents reacting with fear, not with such calculated, chilling composure. She slammed her hand down on the clock, her delicate movements replaced by a sudden, jarring frustration. She chewed on her lip, a rare subconscious sign of perturbation. She stared at Elias. His face remained completely impassive, giving her nothing. No fear, no triumph, only the stillness of profound focus. She realized with a rising sense of unease that she wasn't playing an amateur. She was playing a trap setter. She had to spend precious minutes she never budgeted for such a trivial opponent, reassessing her entire strategy. Her plan for a quick, brutal victory was failing. The board, which had felt open and aggressive moments ago, now felt claustrophobic. She was pressing too hard, and the pressure was being absorbed and subtly returned, twisting her own pieces against her. Victoria, frustrated, finally pushed her central pawn forward in a desperate bid to open lines. It was a good move, a solid move any grandmaster would respect. But it was a move born of impatience and emotion, not perfect, ice-cold calculation. She was playing to win back momentum, not to win the game. Mr. Harrington, the elderly investor, who had noticed Elias's calm demeanor, leaned over to his colleague and whispered, his voice hushed with reverence. This is no accident. It is an ambush disguised as a defense. He is seeding the wings to bait her into an inescapable central coil. He is forcing her into a position of zugzwang, where any move she makes only makes her position worse. Leo, still watching, squeezed his father's shirt sleeve once, lightly, a gesture of silent encouragement. Elias briefly placed his thumb over Leo's small hand, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that truly mattered, a quick, grounding moment in the rising storm of the room. The clock ticked on, each click now magnified in the oppressive silence. Every second felt like an hour. The room's atmosphere had undergone a complete, terrifying transformation. The mood had soured from light entertainment to suffocating, breathless tension. Everyone realized they were witnessing something wholly unexpected. Not a quick humiliation, but a battle of minds where the rules of status and wealth had been temporarily suspended. Victoria's posture stiffened. She was sweating lightly under the spotlight, a fact that mortified her. She had never been pushed this far, this quickly, by anyone, let alone an employee. The usual clarity of her strategic vision was completely clouded by frustration. She had misjudged her opponent entirely, focusing only on his suit, not the depth of his soul. She saw it, the weakness in her forward pawn structure, the one she had pushed impatiently. It was a single tiny point of entry, but it was enough to exploit. She moved her bishop, blocking the line of sight, trying desperately to seal the breach. Elias took his turn. He reached out, his hand moving with the weightless certainty of a man who knows the inevitable outcome, and placed his knight on a square that had been completely defensible only a second ago. He moved into the newly created gap, a perfect, unexpected thrust. The move was quiet, precise, and utterly devastating. The room stood in silent, collective shock. The game, the challenge, the CEO's arrogance, all were about to crash down around them. The final sound in the silent room was the dull click of the chess clock after Elias released his knight. Victoria Sterling stared at the board, her expression frozen in pure disbelief, her face pale beneath the heavy gold light. Elias's third move, the precise placement of his knight, had executed an elegant, brutal maneuver. It was the perfect definition of a forcing sequence. The knight moved to a square where it instantly threatened three of Victoria's major pieces, her queen, her rook, and her vulnerable central bishop, in a devastating fork. Critically, no matter which piece she moved to capture the knight or defend the queen, the resulting position was unrecoverable. It was a forced loss of material leading to an inevitable checkmate within two more moves. The game was, effectively, over. The silence that followed was absolute, complete. It was the sound of 100 people having their collective breath stolen by the cold, beautiful logic of pure intellect. Mr. Harrington, the elderly investor who was a renowned amateur player, finally shattered the silence, his voice trembling with awe and professional respect. He pushed his way to the front, pointing at the board. It's the modified Sicilian defense, an ultra-rare variation, but he used it to force a three-move checkmate sequence. Look, the queen is lost, the defense is broken, and white's king is exposed. He didn't just win, he set the trap from his first move, sacrificed space, and let her walk into it because he knew her aggressive temperament would demand the center. He didn't play the board, he played the woman. It's the highest level of tactical genius. He shook his head slowly, a profound respect in his eyes. A three-move checkmate, virtually unheard of at this level of competitive play. Victoria Sterling, the woman who was never beaten, never wrong, was now speechless. She looked from the devastating knight to her helpless queen to Elias's perfectly impassive face. She saw the truth stark and undeniable. She had been strategically destroyed, annihilated in a sequence that barely began. Her arrogance, her contempt for the cleaning crew, had blinded her to the geometry of the board. She had lost the game the moment she had dismissed her opponent based on his appearance. With a deep, shaky breath, she reached out and slowly, deliberately knocked over her king, the ultimate painful sign of immediate surrender. She had been on the clock for less than 5 minutes. The crowd erupted into confused, excited chatter, a cacophony of astonishment and disbelief. But Victoria didn't hear them. She looked only at Elias. Her eyes, usually cold and sharp with calculation, were now wide with a mixture of shock, dawning humiliation, and a reluctant, painful admiration. She leaned forward across the battlefield, her voice low and tight, stripped of all arrogance. Who are you? You cannot just be a maintenance technician. That level of foresight, it's impossible. Elias finally spoke. His voice was calm, unremarkable, yet it cut through the din like a laser. I am Elias Vance. I work in your maintenance department, and I am Leo's father. He paused, allowing the simple truth to settle. Victoria pressed him further, demanding an explanation for the genius she'd just witnessed. That move, that skill, no one just learns that. You are not an amateur. You are a grandmaster in hiding. Elias sighed, a flash of genuine pain crossing his face, the pain of a lost dream. I was a national-level master, Miss Sterling. I had a sponsorship offer. I was ready to go professional years ago. Had the whole life mapped out. He gestured faintly toward Leo, who was watching with wide, proud eyes. My wife left us when Leo was 4. She couldn't handle the pressure or the quiet, non-glamorous reality of raising a child. She needed more than I could give her. I gave up the tournament circuit to take a job with steady hours and no travel. Chess doesn't pay the hospital bills or tuck a boy into bed every night. I chose him. I chose stability over brilliance. The second revelation was heavier than the first. He hadn't just won a chess game, he had won a profound moral victory. He was a man who had traded the peak of his talent for the quiet, enduring duty of fatherhood, and he did it without complaint. Victoria felt a wave of crushing, debilitating shame. She realized her initial challenge, the flippant offer of marriage, was not just a joke to the room, it was a deep, narcissistic insult to the worth of every person present, particularly the man who had sacrificed everything for his son. She had measured him by his job title, not his sacrifice. She rose slowly, her silk dress rustling like fallen leaves. This was the hardest move of her life, a public concession of not just defeat, but ethical failure. She stood before the crowd she usually dominated and spoke clearly, her voice echoing the undeniable, painful truth. I was beaten, fairly, decisively, by a man whose focus and intellect I grossly underestimated. She looked directly at Elias, the humiliation searing her face. My challenge stands. The room collectively gasped. The marriage offer, once a joke, was now a public, tangible burden. Elias stood up too, towering slightly over her, not in height, but in moral authority. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a simple linen handkerchief, and gently wiped the sweat from the marble edge of the board. He looked at Victoria, then down at his son, whose small chest was puffed up with pride. Elias shook his head, a slight, deeply sorrowful smile playing on his lips. Miss Sterling, I played the game for one reason. My son needed to see that the size of the man is not determined by the clothes he wears or the job he holds. It is determined by his character and his integrity. He stepped away from the board, completely rejecting the impossible prize. I don't want to marry you, and I don't need to humble you. You have done that quite well yourself. The only thing I wanted tonight was for my son to see that the true measure of a person is humility, and that quiet devotion is the most powerful move of all. He walked away from the table, taking Leo's hand. He left behind the shattered CEO, the silent, dumbfounded crowd, and the impossible king and knight frozen on the chessboard. The room was left to contemplate not just a strategic loss, but a devastating ethical failure of their entire gilded existence. The single sound in the club the following morning was not the laughter of the elite, but the low whir of Elias's floor buffer. The atmosphere was completely transformed. The staff, who had always been invisible, were now treated with an almost deferential respect. And Elias Vance, the maintenance technician, was no longer just a face. He was a silent, unapproachable legend whispered about in the hallways. Victoria Sterling handled the aftermath in a characteristically driven way, but her focus had shifted from external conquest to internal truth. She began to investigate him, not his financial records, but his life. She learned about his relentless dedication to Leo, his missed tuition payments, his double shifts, the quiet sacrifices behind the man who had rejected her empire. Her first attempt at outreach was a misstep. She sent a discreet envelope containing a massive, life-changing cash bonus. Elias found it, returned it, and left a simple note. I fix things. I don't accept charity for duty. She realized that money, her greatest weapon, was useless here. She had to approach him on his terms, in his world. She didn't approach him at the club again. Instead, she found him at a local, rundown park, pushing Leo on a swing that Elias himself had recently welded back into service. She didn't arrive in a limousine. She drove her practical, unpretentious car, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater. Their first conversation was awkward, stripped of all pretense. She didn't mention the chess game or the marriage challenge. She simply asked about Leo's favorite comic books and quietly offered to fix the persistent squeak in the swing's chain, a technical detail Elias had missed in his fatigue. Elias, still guarded, was polite but distant. He wasn't interested in her apologies or her business proposals. He just wanted to live his quiet, dignified life, untainted by the chaos of her world. But Victoria was persistent. She saw in Elias a profound, stable virtue that she had never encountered in her ruthless, high-stakes life. She realized that everything she had strived for, power, control, reputation, had made her incapable of seeing true value in the quiet spaces. Slowly, tentatively, a connection began to form. It wasn't romantic, it was human. Leo became the natural bridge, instantly connecting with the woman who brought engaging, complex logic puzzles instead of lavish, meaningless gifts. He sensed her intelligence, and she respected his quiet seriousness. Victoria found herself accepting invitations to simple, shared dinners in Elias's tiny, neat apartment, humble meals where the focus was on conversation, not negotiation. She started learning to listen, truly listen, instead of merely calculating her next winning move. She learned about the quiet sacrifices of love, the enduring strength of duty, and the peace of a life lived without the burden of constant public performance. She started to realize that the life of a CEO was its own gilded trap, forcing her to always look for the next move, never the present moment. One evening, she found a familiar object in his living room, a small wooden chessboard tucked away on a shelf. This time there were no spectators, no bright lights, and no ticking clock. The only sound was the comforting sizzle of dinner on the stove and the rhythmic rhythm of Leo's humming in the next room. Leo, seeing her looking at the board, bounced up. "Do you like playing chess with my dad?" Victoria smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that Elias had never seen before. "I think," she said softly, her eyes meeting Elias's over the centerpiece of their initial conflict, That I would very much like to play more games with your dad, Leo, but only for fun this time. There was no challenge now. There was only genuine choice, a slow, deliberate decision to build something real on stable ground, rather than conquer a territory. Act 5, The Unchallenged King, 700 words, 112 beats. Victoria Sterling finally understood the deepest lesson of the board. The game isn't about the power of the queen, it's about the protection of the king. She realized the value that had truly moved her wasn't Elias's ability to win, but his ability to walk away from the spotlight, his unwavering inherent humility and deep commitment to his son. Elias realized that his dignity was untouchable. He didn't need external validation, not from a CEO's challenge, and certainly not from a marriage proposal. He was respected because he respected himself, and most importantly, because he loved his son unconditionally. He had reclaimed his identity not as a chess master, but as a devoted father. The decision to be together didn't happen in a moment of grand spectacle or a flash of passion. It happened over a quiet weekend morning, with sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of pancakes in the air. They were simply folding laundry, a mundane, intimate act. Victoria looked at the pile of Leo's tiny, brightly colored shirts. She didn't say, "I accept," or "I want you." She was done with those power verbs. She simply said, "I think I finally understand the real goal of the game, Elias." Elias, who was concentrating on matching socks, looked up. "And what is that, Victoria?" "It's not checkmate," she replied, her eyes holding his with absolute sincerity. "It's stability. It's making sure the king never runs out of safe squares. I want to be one of Leo's safe squares, and maybe yours too." It was the most profound commitment either of them had ever made, a commitment to quiet, enduring partnership. No wedding challenge, no public declaration, just a quiet, shared understanding built on respect and shared duty. The relationship formed piece by piece, not between a CEO and an employee, but between two equals, a powerful woman who learned humility and a single father who knew his worth. The wooden chessboard was still in the living room. One afternoon, Leo, now completely comfortable with Victoria, set up the pieces. He placed the final white king onto the board, looking from Victoria to his father. He was learning how to play the game of strategy, but he had already mastered the game of life. The room was bathed in the warm, diffused morning light. The quiet of the apartment was full of love, respect, and the promise of a future. The ultimate message of their story closed softly. True value requires no grand stage. Family is not where you defeat someone in front of a mocking crowd. It is where you are finally allowed to be perfectly, humbly yourself, and where your king is safe forever. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to NL Touching Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.